Hey, good morning and welcome back. And today we'll be talking about the Empire Builder. And the Empire Builder is and was the flagship train of the Great Northern Railway. This train still does run under Amtrak today, and the main change is that they've switched from the Burlington route from Chicago to St. Paul to the Milwaukee Road route. And the Great Northern was the northernmost transcontinental railroad in the United States, and it was built in the late 1800s without federal subsidies, but stick a pin in that, because I have a bone to pick and a massive asterisk. This railroad ran between St. Paul, Minnesota and Puget Sound. It was also a part owner of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle railways, along with longtime partners with its neighbor, the Northern Pacific Railroad. The Great Northern was started off as a small railroad, but is largely built by one man, the person who I've mentioned in several videos, James J. Hill, I've mentioned him a few videos. James J. Hill was a man who grew up on a farm in Ontario, Canada, and had to give up his formal education when his dad died at the age of 15. After bouncing around for a few years, he ended up in the Twin Cities running a steamboat company, and eventually fell into owning an investment company that bought the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. They ran a 200-mile or so rail system around the Twin Cities in 1878. One of the stipulations of the sale by the state of Montana of this railway was that they complete a 100-mile extension to St. Vincent by the end of 1878, which was completed under Hill's leadership by November. For clarification, the sale was approved in March, and by December they had also opened a branch line to Winnipeg, Manitoba. At this point, Hill expanded branch lines to serve farms along the Red River and bought a partial stake in a line to Superior Duluth with the Milwaukee Road. At this time, Hill improved the facilities of what would become the Great Northern around the Twin Cities, including building the stone art bridge at St. Anthony's Falls. This bridge crossed the Mississippi River, which was a huge boon since rivers had always been very problematic for railways, and bridges get expensive, especially when you're crossing a major river like the Mississippi, or frankly any body of water that is fairly long. And also, water is one of our oldest enemies, along with dirt. Along with this bridge, they built a new train station in downtown Minneapolis along the waterfront. At the same time, Hill also saw the Midwest was becoming a crowded web of railways, so he looked west to continue the growth of the railroad, much like the Milwaukee Road did. This included buying a controlling interest in the Montana Central Railway, which hadn't been constructed yet, but it was chartered to build a rail link between Great Falls and Butte. Around the same time, he was also consolidating ownership in various other railways across the upper Midwest and the Great Plains. By the time these various companies were reorganized into the Great Northern, Hill had enough to connect at least far as Spokane. This is also where I have to talk about that pesky little asterisk of the Great Northern being quote-unquote built without land grants or federal subsidies. A handful of the companies that were consolidated into the Great Northern had land grants, so it's not like they weren't used to finance the construction of the Great Northern, or they were just given up. So they may not have gotten grants, like land grants, to build the transcontinental route, but they still absorbed companies that had land grants to build various other segments of rail across the upper Midwest and Great Plains, although I guess in a sense they are countries because Native American tribes, but whatever. I've been over this several times in several videos, so I'm just going to gloss over that one for now. I count these as subsidies to build a railroad because we're talking about getting land grants to, maybe build 2/3 of the mileage between St. Paul and Seattle. Just because they, had to finance the last third themselves privately doesn't mean that they didn't, that doesn't mean that at least I'm not going to give them a free pass because they had, the land grants were only for some parts of the railroad, but not the, transcontinental bits. Like, you still used it to get financing. No one really, I know some people would disbelieve that, but I for one count that as still getting a subsidy, even if it wasn't directly. As construction went west, the railroad needed to survey mountain passes to put a railroad through them. The two main pass crossings that the Great Northern used were the Marias Pass and Stevens Pass. The man who surveyed these were John Frank Stevens, and Stevens Pass is actually named after him. Marias Pass in Montana was surveyed by Stevens and his flathead guide Coonsaw. This pass crosses the Continental Divide at 5,200 feet. Stevens Pass, on the other hand, was from what they can gather, was fairly well known by the natives before it was mapped by Stevens in the late 1880s, or mid to late 1880s, for the Great Northern. According to some records, people surveying the Cascades for the Northern Pacific heard of Stevens Pass, but didn't find it when they were surveying the mountains to cross to Puget Sound, and they ended up using Stampede Pass instead. All this being said, the Great Northern reached Seattle in January of 1893. I almost said 1993, wrong year, wrong century. At this point, the Great Northern was also heavily promoting land sales along its line. As mentioned, the Great Northern did get land grants indirectly because it bought up railways that had them. On top of that, the Great Northern did buy and resell land from the federal government to get people to settle along its lines. Even as late as 1928, the Great Northern was offering low fares for people to travel along the railroad's right-of-way to survey the land and decide what parcel they'd like to buy and live on. These fares were around $2 for round trips and had the ability to get on and off wherever they wanted for up to 21 days, which is like the equivalent of paying $31 for a 21-day pass, which is to compare to the U.S. Rail Pass offered by Amtrak, which is over $400 for a similar time frame. Another point of fame of the Great Northern Railway is Glacier National Park. Jesus. The railroad crosses Marias Pass, which forms the southern boundary of the park. Immediately after the railroad was up and running, they started promoting the area for tourism and even built 3 lodges in the area of what would become Glacier National Park. I keep wanting to call it like Great Basin or Grand Canyon. My brain in English. This region had been important to the natives in the region for a long time. Some tribes spent the winter there because there was ample game. The Blackfoot Reservation sits on the park's eastern edge, and the Flathead Reservation is on the southwestern side of the park. The Great Northern Railway and conservation groups got Congress to designate the area as a park, and in that process, in doing so, it was actually designated as a national forest in 1897. This allowed mining to happen in the area, but it was shown not to be profitable, and after some more advocacy, the Great Northern and other groups got the forest designated a park in 1910. So much like how Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon became more prolific, or at least became in part national parks because of the Union Pacific and the Santa Fe respectively, the Great Northern also had a hand in creating Glacier National Park. Before we get into the passenger services offered by the Great Northern, there is one more point that needs to be discussed about how Hill managed his railways. Hill believed that railways should cooperate with each other in a way that enhanced their business and reduced the cutthroat competition that plagued railways before regulations were passed by Congress. In this way, he believed railroads should work like cartels, in a sense, and the Burlington and the SP&S were also partially owned by the Great Northern, and through its history, the Northern Pacific is, in a ways, kind of a partner and somewhat of a rival, but more partner than less competitor to the Great Northern and to each other. And this is even after the Northern Pacific was sold off by court order. This, along with Hill's management style that he instilled at the Great Northern, paid off. The Great Northern only suffered financial hardship during the Depression when everyone did, and from what I can tell, so did the Northern Pacific. This similar management style also helped when the Hill lines were merged into Burlington Northern in 1970, since they shared a similar corporate culture. It made the merger a lot easier than, say, the Penn Central, which had like completely opposite management like philosophies and style, which is part of the reason why it failed. But that is a whole boondoggle that I am probably never going to cover because it's an Eastern Railroad. The first major train to run the Great Northern Transcon is the Oriental Limited. This was a heavyweight train that was launched across the GN Transcon in 1905 between St. Paul and Seattle. This train was launched as a through train to Chicago over the Burlington system as well. This train was a standard train at the time with open sections, sleepers, tourist sleepers, a few enclosed rooms, and first-class coaches. And I had to look this up in one of their schedules as to what the accommodations actually were, and I'm not really sure what first-class coach was, because as I mentioned in my first video, what one train called a coach, or what one railroad called a coach, and what others called a coach or a chair car or whatever varied a lot. Prior to Amtrak, any term not used by Pullman was generally not used consistently between railroads that didn't work with each other to provide a service. The Oriental Limited was a first-class train, and it ran the route until 1929 and as the first-class train and when the Empire Builder was launched. For the next 2 years, the Oriental Limited was a secondary run on the GN Transcon until 1931, when it went on a hiatus due to the Great Depression, and the Oriental Limited would come back in 1946 after World War II and ran until 1952, and it was rebranded and relaunched as the Western Star. Actually, that's 1951. Sorry. The early secondary trains on the Great Northern Transcontinental route was the Oregonian and the Glacier Park Limited. The Oregonian and Glacier Park Limited were essentially the same train with a different name. They were heavyweight trains that ran the length of the GN Transcon, making more stops than the first-class Oriental Limited. I'm not really sure when the Oregonian started running, and it could have started running as early as 1893 when the Transcontinental line was completed, or at the latest 1905, which is when the Oriental Limited was launched. But the Oregonian was rebranded the Glacier Park Limited in 1915, and this was to further advertise their connection with Glacier National Park, which had become a national park 5 years earlier. And before it was rebranded, railroads were early promoters of places to become national parks, as I mentioned. Not only this, but I did make a video about it in Railroad Vacations where I went into a lot more detail about that. The Empire Builder was the first, or at least first flagship train in the modern sense. The Great Northern launched in 1929. This train was launched as a heavyweight train, though, and it bumped the Oriental Limited as the flagship on the Great Northern. Also, quick note before I stop talking about the Oriental Limited, it was named as such because the Great Northern heavily advertised ship connections to Japan and China from Seattle that they could connect to. At the time, Asia was referred to as the Orient for whatever reason, so the name of the train was meant to convey that connection with the railroad to ships to Asia. So just wanted to clarify that because I know saying that now could also be kind of seen as racist for some reason, because I honestly don't know. I don't keep up with Twitter spats. Reasons why I don't have one, or have one connected to this channel. Anywho, the Empire Builder was launched to memorialize the Great Northern's founder, James J. Hill, who was called the Empire Builder because he cobbled together a bunch of ailing railroads into a coherent and profitable system across the upper Midwest. But anyways, the Empire Builder ran as a heavyweight train for 18 years, from its launch in 1929 to its relaunch in 1947, when it became a full Streamliner when new equipment was received. Prior to this, the Empire Builder ran a similar schedule to the Milwaukee Roads Olympian and a much faster schedule than the Northern Pacific's North Coast Limited. Its heavyweight schedule was just under 60 hours, which by the time Streamliner started running was the standard transcontinental heavyweight schedule. And in 1947, the Great Northern relaunched the Empire Builder as a modern Streamliner after it received an order that it had put into Pullman in November of 1943. It took so many years to deliver due to wartime rationing. Full production also didn't really spin up in the U.S. economy for non-war related materials until 1946. A lot of people don't really realize that there was actually a gap between the end of World War II and the whole post-war world that inspired the Fallout series that my generation kind of thinks the 1950s largely was. And the late 1940s was that transition period between World War II and the Depression, which were seen as these times of hardship and shortage and emotional strain, and the 1950s, which was a sense of collective social psychosis of a segment of society wishing to forget the troubles of the world before 1946 and build the utopia that they thought they were owed. Anyways, my diatribe about the 50s over. The Great Northern classed up its flagship train to offer what was seen as more standard and to rival any other Streamliner in the US at the time. And the Great Northern was looking into the ongoing Streamliner craze when it started in 1934, but it missed the 7-year window of opportunity to launch its own Streamliner before the war started. So another little aside that I want to get into, 7 years for this kind of product really isn't that long, especially considering how long it takes to design and build something like a train. And the Southern Pacific barely got the Coast Daylight and the Lark, or the Noon Daylight, or whatever, when they made it to 2 trains a day, and the Lark before the war started. The first Daylight was only launched in 1937, and when the Morning Daylight and the Afternoon Daylight were relaunched in 1940, we're talking about a year before the war, and the Lark was squeaked out in April of 1941, which is also according to a documentary that I watched about the Daylights. And Pullman was able to make two 14-car Daylight train sets inside of a month, meaning that if the Great Northern ordered its train sets before the war started, it would to have done so before the summer of 1941 to even have a chance of getting these out before Pearl Harbor happened. But anyways, that little wartime production bit aside, what did these new streamlined sets include? Beyond new lightweight streamlined cars from Pullman, it came with its new paint scheme, the Omaha Orange and Great Northern Green. They also paired these new cars with E7 diesel locomotives from EMD, and also kind of a side note on that, this is also the point when EMD started becoming the dominant builder of diesel locomotives pretty much until the 80s. These new sets included one 60-seat coach for local traffic, 3 48-seat coaches for long-distance traffic, at least 4 sleeping cars, a full coffee shop with crew dorm called the Ranch, a full diner, a lounge with some sleepers in it, and a baggage mail combine car. Also, the coffee shop, as I said, had crew dorms because they kind of had to cram the crew somewhere. Another practice was to have a baggage crew dorm combine. Also, with this equipment, the Great Northern took a page out of the Santa Fe's design book and incorporated pictures and paintings from the local geography and the Indians of the region. This included murals and native-inspired decorations within the train. Another way they played into this was the design of the coffee shop, the Ranch, which was designed like a Western saloon. The new fleet cut the schedule down to 45 hours, which was 13 hours faster than the heavyweight version, at least the final schedule of it. This worked out so well that the Empire Builder averaged 75% occupancy for its first year of operation. To further upgrade the services, the Great Northern spent $8.4 million to buy 66 new cars from Pullman in 1949. These cars debuted in June of 1951, and this new equipment was dubbed, I think unofficially or officially, the mid-century Empire Builder, and this was at the golden age of rail travel, and it also started a fever pitch of competition in the Pacific Northwest. The Milwaukee Road and Northern Pacific also tried to up their fleets to compete, and as mentioned in the last video, this is around the same time when the Northern Pacific's North Coast was fully upgraded into being a streamlined train. But to not be outdone, the Milwaukee Road launched its full-length Superdomes in December of 1952, and the Northern Pacific debuted its own Vista Domes, which is similar to the Burlington Zephyrs, which I will probably get into in the next video, in the summer of 1954. And the Great Northern didn't want to be outdone, so it spent like another $6 million to buy 22 Great Domes from Bud, which were also like full-length domes, which entered into service about a year after the Northern Pacific's Vista Domes did. With all this relaunching going on and being done, the Great Northern relaunched its secondary train as the Western Star in 1951. When the mid-century builder, quote-unquote, equipment came in 1951, the older equipment for the most part, which was only 4 years old at this point, was moved on to the secondary train, and the Oriental Limited was renamed the Western Star. The Star directly competed with the Alaskan and Main Streeter when it was launched a year later. It carried local passengers, people traveling on a lower budget, and basically anything else that a passenger train could carry at the time. A normal consist would have the single 60-seat coach for local traffic, two 48-seat day-night coaches, which were the longer distance coaches, and that's what they were named as time went on. Its own coffee shop lounge, a diner, two sleepers, and a buffet lounge observation car, which basically was just like a rounded end cafe car. This train used the same livery as the Empire Builder, and I also would like to note something about the Great Northern. Is they tended to use what were called 16-4 sleepers, which had 16 duplex roomettes and 4 bedrooms, and they also used another car similar to the Way 664, which had 4 sections, 7 duplex roomettes, 3 double bedrooms, and a compartment, and these are actually similar to some of Via Rail's existing equipment that they use on the train to Churchill. Was it Churchill, Ontario? Can't remember what province. Anyways, it's really far north train in Canada. But with all this upgrading and all this competition and all this fevered pitch of everything going on, isn't to say that the Great Northern didn't face problems retaining its numbers on its passenger trains. Management kind of was seeing the writing on the wall all the way back in the 1930s that people were switching from trains to cars and planes. The launch of the Streamliners just delayed this demise. The Empire Builder in its first year carried about 1.7 million people, and this was down to 1 million by 1968. And it was hovering around 800,000 when Amtrak took over in 1971. The Great Northern was able to maintain such good ridership since it was the best way to access Glacier National Park, which was largely served by the Western Star, and it was also serving an incredibly isolated and rural area, which meant that its riders didn't really have as many options to travel. It was either by car or basically the train. They didn't really have airports, and even then the highway systems in a lot of rural parts of this country really suck, because I know because I've lived in one. And even though the GN was facing steep decline, it still ran a high-class service until the end, and it was noted as being one of the best-run passenger trains in the country. These days, Amtrak still runs the Empire Builder, as I mentioned, over a slightly different route between Chicago and St. Paul. And as I mentioned in past video, Amtrak doesn't run secondary trains along any of its long-distance route, and it frankly needs to have more than one train per day, especially over the long-distance multi-day trains on the West Coast. So other than a second run of the Builder, I don't really expect this route to change very much in the next few years. As I mentioned in the last video, a revival of the North Coast Limited might happen, even if it's over a few segments. But yeah, this is where I'm going to leave it. I think this video is actually going to be slightly shorter than the North Coast video, and I hope you did enjoy, and we'll come back for the next one. And I also thank you for doing the, liking, sharing, subscribing, talking to me in the comments. It's been good. Thank you for all of that.